The National Electrical Code, or NEC, provides guidelines for electrical installations, including determining the appropriate conduit size for wiring. When running 10/3 wire with ground in a conduit, it's crucial to select the right size to ensure safety and compliance. There are two primary methods to determine the smallest allowable conduit size: firstly, using NEC Table 3, and secondly, using fill calculations. According to the NEC, Table 3 specifies the minimum conduit size for different wire sizes and combinations. For 10/3 wire with ground, the smallest allowable conduit size is 1/2 inch. Alternatively, you can calculate the minimum conduit size based on the fill percentage. The formula is conduit area equals total cross-sectional area of conductors divided by fill percentage. The fill percentage varies depending on the application. For residential use, it's typically 40%. For commercial applications, it's often 31%. Let's break down the fill calculation method. Firstly, you need to calculate the total cross-sectional area of the conductors. A 10/3 wire with ground contains 3 current carrying conductors and 1 ground wire. Each of the 3 current carrying conductors has a cross-sectional area of 0.529 square inches. Therefore, the total cross-sectional area for these 3 conductors is 3 multiplied by 0.529, which equals 0.1587 square inches. The ground wire has a cross-sectional area of 0.528 square inches. Adding the cross-sectional area of the current carrying conductors and the ground wire gives us the total cross-sectional area. This would be 0.1587 plus 0.528, totaling 0.2115 square inches. Secondly, determine the fill percentage applicable to the installation. For residential applications, the fill percentage is 40%. Thirdly, calculate the required conduit area. Using the formula, conduit area equals total cross-sectional area of conductors divided by fill percentage, we divide 0.2115 square inches by 0.4. This equals 0.52875 square inches. Fourthly, convert the calculated conduit area to a standard conduit size. The closest standard conduit size to 0.52875 square inches is 1/2 inch, which has an internal area of 0.196 square inches. It's important to note that if the calculated conduit size is not a standard size, always use the next larger size. For underground installations, always consult the NEC for specific requirement. For instance, if the calculation resulted in a needed size larger than 1/2 inch, you would choose the next available standard size, such as 3/4 inch. Selecting the correct conduit size is essential for several reasons. Firstly, it ensures adequate space for heat dissipation. Wires generate heat when carrying electricity, and if they're packed too tightly in a conduit, the heat can build up, potentially damaging the insulation and increasing the risk of fire. Secondly, it prevents damage to the wires during installation. Pulling wires through an undersized conduit can scrape or nick the insulation, which can lead to short circuits or ground faults. Thirdly, it makes future maintenance or modifications easier. Having sufficient space in the conduit allows for adding or replacing wires without difficulty. When selecting conduit, consider the type of material. Common types include electrical metallic tubing, or rigid metal conduit, or RMC, and polyvinyl chloride, or PVC conduit. ENT is lightweight and easy to bend, making it suitable for many indoor applications. RMC is a heavier gauge steel conduit that provides excellent protection against physical damage and is often used in outdoor or corrosive environments. PVC conduit is non-metallic, resistant to corrosion, and commonly used in underground applications. Always use appropriate fittings and connectors for the chosen type of conduit to ensure secure and watertight connection. When pulling wires through the conduit, use a lubricant specifically designed for electrical applications to reduce friction and prevent damage to the insulation. Be sure to follow all applicable local and national electrical codes and regulations to ensure safe and compliant installation. Consult with a qualified electrician if you have any doubts or questions about selecting the appropriate conduit size or installing electrical wiring. The NEC is updated regularly, so it's important to use the latest edition. Understanding and adhering to these guidelines will help ensure a safe and reliable electrical system. In summary, selecting the correct conduit size for 10/3 wire with ground involves either referencing the NEC Table 3 or performing fill calculations. Remember to consider the application, whether it's residential or commercial, and always err on the side of caution by choosing the next largest size if the calculation falls between standard sizes. By following these steps, you can ensure a safe and compliant electrical installation. Always prioritize safety and consult with a qualified professional when needed. Understanding wire gauge and amperage is also crucial. The 10 refers to the American wire gauge, or AUG, size of the conductors. In general, a 10 AWG copper wire is typically rated for a maximum of 30 amps. However, it's essential to consult the NEC for specific ampacity ratings based on factors such as insulation type, temperature rating, and installation method. Overloading a wire can cause it to overheat, potentially leading to insulation damage, fire hazards, or equipment failure. Therefore, it's important to select the appropriate wire gauge for the intended load. When choosing a circuit breaker or fuse, it should be sized to protect the wire. A 30 amp circuit breaker would typically be used with 10 AWG wire. However, again, consult the NEC for specific requirements based on the application. Remember that the 3 in 10/3 indicates the number of current carrying conductors. In this case, there are 3 conductors, typically a hot wire, a neutral wire, and a second hot wire in some 240 volt circuits. The ground wire is separate and provides a path for fault current to return to the source, helping to prevent electrical shock. When working with electrical wiring, always energize the circuit before making any connections or modifications. Use appropriate personal protective equipment, or PPE, such as insulated gloves and safety glasses. Double-check all connections to ensure they are tight and secure. Loose connections can cause arcing, overheating, and potential fire hazard. If you're unsure about any aspect of electrical wiring, it's always best to consult with a qualified electrician. They have the knowledge and experience to ensure a safe and compliant installation. In addition to selecting the correct conduit size and wire gauge, it's also important to consider the type of equipment being powered. Certain appliances or devices may have specific wiring requirements. For example, a motor may require a dedicated circuit with a specific wire gauge and overcurrent protection. Always follow the manufacturer's instructions and consult the NEC for guidance. Remember that electrical codes and regulations are in place to protect people and property from electrical hazards. Adhering to these codes is essential for ensuring a safe and reliable electrical system. If you're working on a project that requires electrical wiring, take the time to educate yourself on the applicable codes and regulations. There are many resources available, including the NEC, online tutorials, and training courses. By following these guidelines, you can help ensure a safe and compliant electrical installation. Electrical work can be dangerous if not performed properly. If you're not comfortable working with electricity, it's always best to hire a qualified electrician. They have the training, experience, and tools to do the job safely and correctly. In summary, selecting the correct conduit size for 10/3 wire with ground involves either referencing the NEC Table 3 or performing full calculations. Remember to consider the application, whether it's residential or commercial, and always err on the side of caution by choosing the next larger size if the calculation falls between standard sizes. Also remember to consider the ampacity local codes, and always seek a professional if you have questions.